This is the Argument Ninja Podcast, episode 20. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the show. I'm your host, Kevin Delaplante. It's been a while since the last episode, over a month, in fact. But as regular listeners will recall, I was invited to spend a couple of weeks at a university in China this summer, and that trip took place during the past month. So on this episode, I thought I'd share with you some of the highlights of the trip and the talks that I gave there. I took a lot of pictures, by the way, and you can find a photo essay about the trip on my blog at kevindelaplante.com, and which is also linked in the show notes for this episode at argumentninja.com. Let me start with a reminder of how this trip came about. Early in May of this year, a faculty member from the philosophy department at Xidian University reached out to me, Dr. Joy Zhu. FYI, Joy is the Western name she uses in her correspondence with English-speaking Westerners, so I've been calling her Joy from the start, but that's not her given Chinese name. Anyway, Joy sends me a note and says, "Hi, I'm a faculty member at Xidian University in China and the director of the Center for Cross-Cultural Studies." That's Xidian for Xidian, by the way. "I have just read your paper on the biodiversity ecosystem function debate. I would be happy to invite you to come this June to speak to our students and faculty. Our university is located in Xi'an. Again, that's Xian for Xi'an. You might know the Terracotta Warriors as a tourist destination for this city. If you are interested, please contact me and we can talk about the details. Thanks for your time." Well, you can imagine this was a surprise to me for a number of reasons. First, this sounded like an academic institution inviting me to visit based on academic work I had done, but I haven't had an academic affiliation for a while. Second, the paper she referenced on biodiversity and ecosystem functioning was part of my former life as a philosopher of science, working on issues in the philosophy of ecology. So it seemed like this invitation really had nothing to do with my work on critical thinking, the focus of my time for the past few years. And third, the time frame for arranging this visit was really short. I would be leaving for this trip in June, the following month. For academic visits of this length, you normally plan them at least 6 months in advance. For a trip to China, there are travel visas to arrange, for example. I didn't know what to make of this, so of course I did what anyone with a computer would do. I Googled Xidian University. I Googled their philosophy department. I Googled Joy. And I poked around until I was confident that this was a real thing. And it was a real thing. Joy, turns out, has a background in Chinese intellectual history and the history of science. She's also very interested in environmental issues and conservation of old-growth forests in China, and in psychological issues relating to human well-being and our experience of the natural environment. She's spent some time in the U.S. working with Peter Wenz, who is a well-known environmental philosopher at the University of Illinois. And this term, I discovered, she was teaching undergraduate classes in the philosophy of science and the philosophy of ecology. So when she was gathering readings for the ecology course, she ran across a book that I had edited on the philosophy of ecology, and that biodiversity paper was in that book. And that's basically how I came to her attention. So now it made sense why she was interested in bringing me in. That's what people in academia do when they have resources to bring in speakers. If at all possible, you bring in people who you would want to visit with. And since she's got these 2 classes going on, which are right in my wheelhouse, it made sense that I could pop in and visit with the students in these classes. Well, long story short, I was happy to agree to go, and we moved really fast to plan the trip. Now, part of my schedule was that I was slotted to do 2 large public lectures, 2 classroom visits with students, and 2 informal visits with faculty. I could basically pick the topic for the public lectures, so I agreed to do a talk on science literacy and a talk on critical thinking as a martial art. And I sent her brief descriptions of those talks for advertising purposes. There were some hiccups with the visa, but everything worked out eventually, and on June 25th, I found myself driving to the airport here in Ottawa, getting ready for a 21-hour trip to Xi'an, China. Now, I don't know about you, but when I plan a trip to someplace really new, where I know I'll be staying for a stretch of time, I research the shit out of it. I want to know where I'm going, what to bring, what to expect, how not to make stupid traveler mistakes, and so on. So, first off, the university is pretty big. It's got about 40,000 students. It's a science and tech university. Their big programs are in electronic engineering. I got the impression from their promotional videos that there were more foreign students there, but it turns out that there are only about 800 foreign students in a population of 40,000 students. Xi'an, the city, is also big. Like almost 9 million people big. Bigger than New York City. Still not as big as Beijing, but Xi'an is clearly a major city. It's also a city that's over 3,000 years old. For 2,000 years, it was the capital city of China. So I expected the city to be big and sprawling and incredibly interesting, and it was. Now, I also learned that it gets hot in the summer, and July and August are the worst months. So I was leaving a city where the temperature was 24 Celsius, or about 75 Fahrenheit, and traveling to a city where the temperature for the next 2 weeks was forecasted to be in the high 30s and even the 40s, which is well over 100 Fahrenheit. So I had to prepare for that. I'm a 50-year-old Canadian. I sweat in the heat. It's not pretty. I also wanted to know how much English I could expect from the locals, service workers, storefront workers, etc. And the answer is little to none. On average, maybe 1 in 100 Chinese speaks any English. Younger people study English in school, and university students are the most fluent as a demographic group. But once you're outside the school environment, and you're walking up and down streets and poking your head into local shops and restaurants, or trying to hail a cab, don't expect the people working there to understand your English. Here are some other travel tips I picked up before leaving. 1. You can't drink the tap water. Almost anywhere in China. Too many heavy metals, it'll make you sick. Chinese people drink bottled water or boil water on the stove, and they carry water with them everywhere. 2. Bring your own toilet paper. Or at least bring wet wipes or Kleenex or whatever you prefer, but bring it with you and keep it with you when you're out. A lot of Chinese bathrooms don't keep toilet paper, or it doesn't get refilled regularly. And many eating places don't have napkins. 3. Be on the lookout for squat toilets. They're the norm in China. Western-style seat toilets are less common. My hotel room had a seat toilet, which I was grateful for. And many places have rows of toilet stalls where the last 2 on the end, say, are labeled as seat toilets. Anyway, you should get familiar with how you're supposed to use them if you find yourself in a situation where you can't avoid them. FYI, you face the front, the opposite direction you would face if you're using a seat toilet. Number 4, bring an umbrella for the sun. On a hot sunny day, the streets are filled with people walking with umbrellas open. Very rational practice. I wish it was more common in the West. I was warned that as a foreigner, I would stand out and local people would stare. I actually found that this wasn't the case for me. I did a daily walk in the morning from my hotel room to the university restaurant, and then on through some university roadways, and there were lots of people on the streets and sidewalks. But I didn't get a sense of people staring at me. For the most part, they seemed to ignore me, and I was the only non-Chinese person in sight for most of my trip. But I did speak to a woman from North Carolina on the flight home who said that she and her sister had a horrible time with staring on their trip. People just walking up and taking pictures of her without asking. So maybe it's just because I'm not as interesting to look at as a 29-year-old blonde woman. Anyway, let me tell you about my first big travel mistake. I discovered it in the air on the flight from Ottawa to Vancouver. When you travel, you should always have some kind of game plan if your wallet is lost or stolen overseas. How would you get money? Where do you keep your passport? Do you have a health insurance card? I took out some funds in Chinese currency before I left, and I kept some in my wallet and some in other places in my carry-on. Another thing they tell you to do is photocopy your major cards, both front and back, and keep that piece of paper with you somewhere when you're traveling, not in your wallet, so that if you lose your wallet, you still have access to the card numbers and the contact numbers if you need to call credit card companies. So I did that. I scanned my cards on the scanner in my office at home and packed the copy in a safe place. Now, I'm on the plane, en route to Vancouver, where I'll transfer to Beijing. It's about a 5-hour flight. I'm talking to a nice guy beside me, about philosophy, actually. The flight attendant comes around with some beverage options, and I asked for something that I honestly can't remember now. Not an alcoholic drink, but it wasn't free. I needed to pay in cash. So I take out my wallet, and even before I open it, my brain registers that the wallet feels thinner than it should be. I open the wallet. There's cash in there, but no debit card, no credit card, no health insurance card. I still have my passport that's in my other pocket. The guy beside me is looking at me, and I'm looking at him, and he can tell from my expression that something is wrong. My cards are still under the scanner cover in my office. And now I'm en route. There's no turning back now. So my seatmate and I did a quick assessment of how bad the situation really was. And we concluded that it wasn't the end of the world. My expenses were being paid. I had enough cash to get by. And I had those card numbers with me. I thought maybe I might be able to set up something like Apple Pay where I can use my phone to pay for things. Anyway, I'll tell you what I did not do. It's not an exaggeration to say that my wife is a worrier when I travel. She's a bit of an anxious traveler herself, and I'm a proxy for that anxiety when I'm traveling by myself. If I had landed in Vancouver and called her and told her about this, A, she would have freaked out, and B, her worries about something else going wrong on this trip would have shot way up. Because she'll assume, maybe rightly, that I can't be trusted not to make stupid mistakes like this. Well, that's the availability heuristic in action, folks. Kahneman and Tversky, thinking fast and slow. When you're asked to estimate the likelihood of a certain type of event occurring, like forgetting your wallet somewhere, or needing medical attention when traveling in a foreign country, what your brain does is answer a different question. How easy is it for me to imagine or recall an event of this type occurring? How available is this kind of event to my imagination? How vividly can I visualize it? If it's easy to imagine the event, then you'll judge the likelihood to be higher than you otherwise would. So in her case, dumb screw-ups like this would now be very easy to visualize, and she would be much more worried that something similar would happen again on this trip. This isn't just a guess. I know her. We've been married for 26 years. So I ended up not telling her. And I managed to get through the trip without any financial worries or other screw-ups. When I finally got home, I went upstairs, lifted the cover on the scanner, saw all the cards exactly where I had left them, scooped them up, and put them back in my wallet. And then about 3 days after returning, I told my wife about the whole thing. She actually was pretty cool about it, but of course she knew that I had returned safely by then. And she did wonder if maybe it'd be better if I hadn't told her, because now she'd be worrying about this on my next trip. So check your wallet one last time before you leave your house. Let's fast forward. I've arrived in Xi'an. There were some delays with connections, so at this point, I've been up for about 30 hours. Joy picks me up at the airport with a university car driver. We drive back to the university hotel where I'll be staying. It's well after midnight. I have the day off tomorrow to recover, which I'm very grateful for. My hotel suite is bigger than I thought it would be. There's a room with a sofa and a TV, a big bedroom with a desk and another TV, and a large bathroom with a Western-style shower and toilet. My hotel card key opens the door, but it's also a key to electricity in the room. Right beside the door on the wall, when you walk in, there's a slot for your key. You put the key in the slot, and now your room has power. Lights, air conditioning, TV. When you leave the room, you take your key, and all the power is shut off. So it's impossible to leave the lights on or the air conditioner running. I don't know if this is common at hotels in hot climates, but I thought it was pretty clever. The bed is nice and big. It's lower and harder than any bed I've ever experienced. I assume this is the preference here. I'm exhausted. I have a good sleep. At 8 o'clock in the morning, I hear what sounds like children's music playing outside my window. There's a kindergarten school across the way, and from my window I can see children lined up in rows in the outdoor play area, following some teachers doing a morning exercise routine. When I step into the hallway in the hotel, the heat hits right away. It's already hot. The rooms have air conditioning, but the building doesn't. My hotel is just south of the campus gates. It's about a 10-minute walk to a campus cafeteria. I've got a university card loaded with some cash so I can tap it for purchases at the restaurant. So I go there for breakfast every morning that I'm there. That 10-minute walk is along some very nice tree-lined streets that already have lots of people walking up and down them when I get up. The area that I'm in is surrounded by apartment housing for faculty and staff and graduate students at the university. There's a kindergarten and a middle school right nearby. So in the morning, you see lots of parents bringing their children to drop off at the kindergarten, and lots of people who are on their way to work at the university. There's a road that I have to cross every day to get into campus. There are lots of cars, but also lots of public rental bicycles, lots of electric scooters, no helmets. Everyone rides helmet-free for the most part. There are also lots of what look like three-wheel stretch motorcycles, tricked out with cargo beds for carrying fruits and vegetables. They park themselves on street corners and sell right off the cart. Driving on the roads is more chaotic than I'm used to. There are lots of different kinds of vehicles traveling at different speeds trying to share the road. Lots of lane changing without signaling. Lots of beeping and honking to let people know you're there. At the restaurant cafeteria, I walk in and it's a huge square with tables in the center and stations along the sides for serving different kinds of foods. You go up to the station, pick your food, they serve it up, and there's a tap screen right on the glass where the price pops up. You tap your card and it automatically shows you the remaining balance on your card. And that's how everyone pays for food. No one working behind the counter speaks English, and all the descriptions of the dishes are in Chinese. So basically, I order by pointing. Most of the time, I don't know what it is I'm pointing at. But almost everything tastes great, so it's an enjoyable surprise. It's nothing like a Chinese buffet you would get at a North American Chinese restaurant. One of the first things I notice is that the food options are really diverse and really healthy. Real food, real vegetables, real meat. No pizza, no hamburgers, no French fries, no fried chicken. Lots of soups. People eat a lot of soup here. I ate with chopsticks every day, and I loved eating that way. It slows you down. It makes it hard to rush. And no sweet desserts that I could recognize. No junk food, no bags of chips, no chocolate bars. You could get soda in bottles, but I rarely saw anyone drinking soda. Anyway, I was really impressed with the food culture here. It'd be very easy to be a vegetarian here, much easier than in North America, in my opinion. Probably 75% of the dishes were vegetarian, and I found many of them to be the tastiest dishes, though I usually had no real idea of what I was eating or how it was prepared. What looks like a noodle might end up being tofu. What looks like a bean might end up being some kind of root vegetable that doesn't have an English name. Now, on most mornings, after breakfast, I would go for a little walk down the road that leads into campus. It's an older part of campus, so the trees are tall and give lots of shade. There's a big soccer field along this route, surrounded by a wide running track. It's inset into the ground a bit, with seating along the sides. And every morning before work, between like 6 a.m. and 8:30 a.m., hundreds of people of all ages would gather in and around this public space and participate in some kind of physical activity. Lots would jog around the track, but others would break off into groups to do Tai Chi. Older people would gather at a set of upright bars and do calisthenics or stretching. Off to the side, in these little park spaces, other Tai Chi groups would set up. Some of them did Tai Chi with fans. I saw a small group with swords. Some do group dancing with scarves and colorful costumes. So I would go here in the morning to people watch, mostly. The fitness culture in China is quite different than in North America, and there are parts of it that I really like. You don't see fitness gyms with weight centers on every street corner. Younger students do use the fitness centers on campus, but for much of the rest of the population, physical activity is something you still do in groups or in public spaces. This group here was very decentralized. They weren't following a broadcast program of calisthenics. Everyone was basically doing their own thing. Students in school, on the other hand, all across the country, are required to assemble and perform an exercise routine in the morning. And in work culture in China, it's very common to start the day with a group activity or a workout. It signals a transition from your personal home life to your work life. And I learned that radio calisthenics, where you broadcast music and exercise directions on the radio at set times of the day, is still popular across China, Taiwan, and Japan. And interestingly, the idea for radio calisthenics actually originated back in the US. During the 1920s, the MetLife Insurance Company sponsored these 15-minute radio calisthenics programs broadcast in major cities in the US. And visitors from a Japanese postal insurance company brought samples of the exercises back to Japan. And they got picked up and were used to improve the health of Japanese soldiers in the 1930s and 40s. Now, after Japan's defeat in 1945, the broadcasts were stopped. They were viewed as too militaristic, and they only returned to Japan later. But in China, in the early 50s, Chairman Mao picked up radio calisthenics and used it during the Communist Revolution as part of his program for unifying the country and building a strong modern nation. So from 1951 to the present day, there's been a succession of government-developed, government-mandated calisthenics regimens in China. Anyway, I was struck by this spontaneous, collective use of public space. It's not something I'm used to seeing where I live. And I think it's a good idea. That and the amateur public dance troupes for older ladies and the walking and biking everywhere are all fitness trends that I think we could benefit from back in North America. So let's get back to the purpose for this trip. My first official function was a visit to Dr. Zhu's philosophy of ecology class. The classroom was one of the more modern additions to the university. It looked like a great setup to teach in. It had these cool roller chairs you could reposition around the room, and a whole back wall filled with monitors you could project material on. The class was recorded on audio and video, so anyone speaking had to have a hand mic, and several of these were passed out around the room. So like I said, these students had read a paper of mine that was included in an edited anthology on the philosophy of ecology, for which I was also one of the co-editors. So we spent the first half of the class talking about this paper. I was actually surprised to learn that this reading was assigned to an undergraduate class, since the topic was pretty narrow in some respects. But it does touch on some big conceptual questions. The title of the paper was The Biodiversity Ecosystem Function Debate in Ecology. And even though the publication date is 2011, I actually wrote it closer to 10 years ago. Now, at the time, I was working with a PhD student in sustainable agriculture at Iowa State University. His name is Valentin Picasso. He's from Ecuador, and he was doing a research project on effects of diversity on productivity in various cropping methods. He was also a former student in the philosophy of ecology class that I was teaching back in the mid-2000s, and we had a good working relationship. Valentin's work drew on experimental results that linked changes in biodiversity to changes in various so-called ecosystem functions. And that research had been subject to some criticism by other ecologists, and criticism about the way that these results had been used to support various environmental agendas. So in the first chapter of Valentin's doctoral dissertation, we thought it would be helpful to give a good introduction to these debates. I ended up writing about 80% of this chapter, and then I integrated Valentin's literature research into the last 20% or so. This became the first chapter of his dissertation, and it was published as a co-authored paper. I don't want to bore you with details, but here's the general philosophy issue that is lying behind this debate, and it's an important critical thinking issue too. When scientists look out into the universe and come up with theories to describe and explain the phenomena they're seeing, how do we know that our theories are describing real patterns that are out there in the real world, and not merely projecting onto the phenomena what we want to see or expect to see because of some philosophical or religious or ideological commitment? Let me give you an example. When the Greeks were studying the heavenly bodies and coming up with explanations for the motions of the planets and the moon and the sun and the stars around the earth, they had lots of observational data that they needed to account for. Why the stars maintain their relative positions, but the planets drift against the background of the stars. Why the planets and the sun and the moon all move within a particular plane across the sky. Why the sun is higher in the sky in the summer and lower in the sky in the winter. Why days are longer in the summer and shorter in the winter. Why the moon shows phases that change on a 28-day cycle. Why Mercury and Venus are never seen far from the sun, but Mars and Saturn and Jupiter can be seen on the opposite side of the sky as the sun. These observable phenomena put constraints on what an acceptable theory will look like. It should, at a minimum, not generate predictions that contradict these observational facts. But the Greeks imposed additional constraints on their theories as well. They believed that the heavens were the domain of the gods, the divine realm. The earthly realm, the terrestrial realm, was corrupted and changing. Things on earth come into being and grow and die. The heavenly realm, the celestial realm, on the other hand, was divine and therefore perfect. It had to be. And if it's perfect, that must mean that it's unchanging. For why would a perfect thing have any reason to change? So the Greeks assumed that the only motion suitable to a heavenly body was perfect circular motion that doesn't speed up or slow down ever. They viewed this as so obviously true that for them it had the status of a fact, but a conceptual fact, not an observational fact. You can't see the perfect circular motions from Earth. What we see from our vantage point are lots of irregular, non-uniform motions. But the Greeks believed that the true motions of the heavenly bodies must be uniform and circular. So they built that assumption into their models. And the result, in the hands of Ptolemy, the great 2nd century Greek mathematician, was an Earth-centered model of the cosmos, where the motions of the stars and planets are the mathematical composition of dozens of perfect circular motions, with circles on top of circles on top of circles. And this ended up being a very successful predictive model. You could use it to predict the motions of the sun and the moon and the planets with great accuracy, years in advance. This geocentric model was basically accepted without challenge for 1400 years, until the 16th century when Copernicus came along and offered the first serious alternative. And now we can look back and see that, in spite of its predictive successes, Ptolemy's theoretical model was wrong. In just about every way a model can be wrong. The Earth isn't motionless at the center of the cosmos. Heavenly bodies don't move in perfect uniform circles. The stars aren't all at the same distance from the Earth. But more importantly, we can see that the Greeks were guilty of projecting a conception of divine perfection onto nature that wasn't really there, and that led them into error. And at the same time, the success of Ptolemy's theory and the status it had helped to reinforce this conception of divine perfection and its contrast with terrestrial imperfection. Now, in science studies and in the philosophy of science, we have a term that isn't widely known outside of a certain narrow usage, but which I think is useful. It's an inference pattern known as a double induction. Don't worry if you haven't heard of this, it's not standard usage. But here's the pattern. In studying some domain of nature, I bring some ideological or social worldview to bear, and I project that worldview onto what I'm studying. So I see this worldview reflected in the nature that I'm studying. That's the first induction. And then I turn around and say, look, our belief system is confirmed by nature itself. Our way of life is justified because it's natural. It reflects the natural order. That's the second induction. We use the observations of nature to rationalize the ideology that we projected onto our descriptions of nature in the first place. A classic example is British Victorian England, with its monarchy and rigid class structure. Natural historians studying beehives would draw pictures of the social organization of bees that almost perfectly reproduce the monarchy and class system, with a single queen bee, worker bees, drone bees, and so on. And then they could point at it and say, look, see, hierarchy and monarchy is natural. It's the way that industrious creatures were designed by God to fulfill their potential. There are lots of examples like this. With the rise of capitalism and a Darwinian survival of the fittest ideology, scientists started to pay more attention to competition among species in nature and the culling of the unfit as a primary mechanism of evolution. Social theorists then used these seemingly objective scientific descriptions of nature to support a Darwinian view of human society and social progress, and to justify programs of population control and selective breeding to reduce undesirable qualities in human populations. This kind of thinking can happen anywhere. On the political left, for those who were inspired by Marx and Engels' 19th century philosophy of dialectical materialism, there's a conception of nature there that's built into that worldview. It's a process-oriented worldview where natural laws govern the formation of increasingly more complex forms of organization, and where the relationships and interconnectedness of the parts is the primary determinant of system-level behaviors. In this view, what determines the nature of the parts within the system is largely determined by the relation of those parts to the rest of the system and to their role within the system. Now, this kind of philosophical worldview is biased toward holistic theories and methods in science, and biased against reductionistic approaches. And that has implications for how science is done and how it's used. You see this, for example, in Soviet science in the 1940s and 50s that rejected modern genetics, partly because it was a foreign import, but also because it was viewed by some in power as ideologically incompatible with dialectical materialism and their view of human nature. But at the same time, the Soviets developed mathematical systems theory to a high level, and what we now call theories of self-organization in the physical sciences, because those were viewed as congenial to the evolutionary, system-oriented viewpoint of dialectical materialism. So, just to bring this back to our original topic, when you're studying the natural world, you need to be on the lookout for biases that can creep in due to one's philosophical or ideological worldview. Now, to some extent, this is inevitable, but it's particularly concerning if you're appealing to science to tell you what's natural, and then conclude that some particular social order that you happen to prefer is natural and therefore justified. People have found justifications for almost every social practice this way. Science tells us that slavery is natural, racial discrimination is natural, fixed gender roles are natural, colonialism is natural, hierarchy is natural, free market capitalism is natural, communism is natural. This is a seductive path. You don't want to find yourself projecting your ideology onto the science and then using that same science to justify your ideology. That's the double induction. Well, just to bring it around, in the biodiversity ecosystem function debate, there was a version of this accusation going around. And my paper was about unpacking this accusation in that context. I think I've spent enough time on this already, so I'll just leave it at that. But this is the sort of thing we talked about in the first half of my class with these philosophy of ecology students. After this class, I had a chance to visit with some of the students as we were walking across campus, and many of them had questions that helped me get more of a sense of them as individuals. Where do I live in Canada? Had I ever had KFC, Kentucky Fried Chicken, and what did I think of it? I was surprised by that question, but it turns out that KFC has a huge franchise operation in China. Did I follow the Toronto Raptors? NBA basketball is pretty popular here. Do I like LeBron James? I had a chat with a thoughtful fellow who talked about technology making us fat and lazy and dependent, and he referred to what happened to the humans in Wall-E, if you remember that Pixar movie. These students were all really lovely. I would have been happy to have any of them in my classes when I was an actual university teacher. Now, the next day, I had my first public lecture, which was on the elements of genuine science literacy. If you've been following me for a while, you might be familiar with my take on science literacy. I've got a collection of videos on this topic inside the Critical Thinker Academy. My view is that if you define science literacy as the ability to think critically about the nature of science and its role in modern life, then most people are not scientifically literate. And in fact, most people with advanced degrees in science are not scientifically literate. And that's because genuine science literacy has more to do with understanding the philosophy of science and the broader landscape of science than the kind of science education you get in normal public schooling or the professional training you get in undergraduate and graduate programs in science. I'll give you an example of the kind of understanding that I think defines science literacy. Back in 2015, a Canadian politician named James Lunny, a member of Parliament in British Columbia, made a statement in defense of another MP who had told reporters that he didn't believe in evolution. Now, here's a longer statement of Lunny's from a couple years earlier. Quote, "Any scientist who declares that the theory of evolution is fact has already abandoned the foundations of science. For science establishes fact through the study of things observable and reproducible. Since origins can neither be reproduced nor observed, they remain the realm of hypothesis." Unquote. So here's a politician making a public statement about the scientific status of evolutionary theory and a statement about scientific reasoning in general. I think that if science literacy means anything, it should mean being able to critically examine and assess statements like this, simple statements about the nature of science. Minimally, you should be able to assess whether this is a reasonable thing to say about science. Now, I've given this short quote to students, and many science students, and asked them to comment on it. But first, I get them to clarify, as best they can, the general methodological principle that this statement is expressing. And this by itself is actually a hard assignment for many students. They have a hard time teasing apart claims about evolution from claims about science in general, and separating their own views about evolution from their assessment of the general claim. The general claim is this: the basis of scientific inference is observation and reproducibility. For anything to qualify as a well-founded scientific theory or a scientific fact, it has to be observable and reproducible. And it's clear from the context that by observable, he means directly observable. To get observable data about origins, you would literally need to go back in time and take observations directly. But you can't do that, so we can have no observable data about origins. And if well-founded science requires reproducibility, well, facts about origins can't be reproduced either. You can't do repeated trials of evolutionary histories to see how things might have gone differently in the past. Now, when I lay out these principles to a group of science students and ask them what they think of them, in my experience, about half of them think they're true, that this is a reasonable way to think about science. And the other half thinks there must be something wrong here because they don't want to follow the logic and say that evolution isn't well-founded science. But they're not confident about where the problem lies. So even students with 10 or 12 years of science education under their belts have a hard time with this. But this picture of scientific reasoning is just false, and anyone can see it's false with just a little instruction. Let's just focus on the observable facts part, because that's really the crux of the problem. It's just false to say that we can't have well-grounded beliefs about events or processes that we can't observe directly. This picture ignores the crucial role that hypothetical reasoning plays in all of science, and in fact, in much of our ordinary reasoning about the world. We frame hypotheses about the way the world works. Then we ask the question, if this hypothesis was true, if this model of the world was true, what would be the observable consequences? What difference would it make to what we can observe directly? This is the stage where we make predictions about what the world would look like to us if the hypothesis was true. Then we compare these predictions with the observable facts, and on the basis of this, we make inferences about the hypothesis. Are the predictions confirmed? Are they falsified? Do they raise or lower our confidence in the hypothesis? In other words, we test theoretical hypotheses indirectly by testing their observable consequences. Go to a doctor with a problem, they'll ask for your symptoms. Different hypotheses about the cause generate different observable symptoms. The doctor uses your symptoms to narrow down the possibilities. That's indirect hypothetical reasoning. When a person has pancreatic cancer, the levels of certain proteins in the blood go up. These proteins can be detected by blood tests. The proteins are not tumors, they're not the cancer in your pancreas, but they're a predictable effect of cancer in your pancreas. We test for the observable effects of a cause and infer backward to the cause. This is indirect reasoning, indirect testing of hypotheses by testing observational consequences of those hypotheses. This is how we know with great confidence the basic processes that power the inside of the sun, which obviously we can't observe directly, right? This is how we know about the internal structure of atoms. We can't observe any of these structures directly, it's all indirect reasoning. So, if you insist that we can never have well-supported scientific knowledge of events in the past, because we can't observe those events directly, then you should tell that to astronomers and cosmologists, and geologists, and paleontologists, and physical anthropologists, because they'll want to hear that the basic reasoning patterns they use in their fields show that they have, in Lunny's words, abandoned the foundations of science. Because that's what's implied about James Lunny's view of scientific reasoning. Now, my general point here is that Lunny's statement about the nature of science is false, and it's obviously false to anyone with a little tutoring and reflection on some simple examples of scientific reasoning. But Lunny didn't see it as false, he thought it was reasonable, and none of the press that I'm aware of called him out on it when he made these statements. And more importantly, most of the science students I teach, who've had years of science education, can't tell you what's wrong with this view even when you lay it out for them. This is the kind of thing I mean when I talk about science literacy as an ability to think critically about the nature of science, and that even people who have lots of training in science can still, for practical purposes, be scientifically illiterate. Now, I think this is a problem because I think science literacy is important for a democratic citizenship in modern technological societies. But I don't blame the public education system or academia for failing to teach science literacy. And the reason I don't blame them is because science literacy has never been a goal of public science education. It makes no sense to blame an institution for failing to realize a goal if that was never their goal. So, what is the actual goal of public science education? Well, it's not a mystery. Public education is state-funded education. What's the rationale for state-funded science education? Ultimately, it's about developing a labor force with a certain skill set that can support the goals of the state. If you break it down a bit, the goal of publicly supported science education is to identify and prepare students who, down the line, 1, can successfully compete for jobs that require science and technology skills, 2, can contribute to the economic goals of the science and technology industry, and 3, can produce original research that is perceived as making a relevant contribution within a scientific field. Now, I think that the system of science education you find in the richer industrialized countries actually does a pretty good job of meeting these goals. My point is that you can do all of this very well and still not produce citizens that are scientifically literate. You can be a good scientist and not be scientifically literate. Anyway, this is a topic I've talked about before on the podcast, so I don't want to belabor the point too much. I laid all this out in my talk, and in the rest of the talk, I laid out a curriculum that actually teaches the elements of science literacy. This curriculum is broken into 5 units. There's a unit on the vocabulary of science, a unit on the logic of science, a unit on the methods of science, a unit on the landscape of science, and finally, a unit on the ethics of science. If you want to learn more about this, I've got some videos in my Critical Thinking About Science course over at the Critical Thinker Academy. You could teach this curriculum to high school students. It's not all that technical. But I have no illusions that it will ever become part of the public science curriculum. For the reasons I just stated, it's not part of the public education mandate. I could teach it in the Critical Thinker Academy, but it's a big project that would need financial support for my time over an extended period of time, and I'm just not there yet, unfortunately. I'm going to jump ahead now to my second public talk, which was several days later. This one was titled, Why Critical Thinking is a Martial Art. So it connects with my more recent work on critical thinking and the whole argument ninja approach. I'll tell you some of my concerns about this topic going in. In the US and Canada, the language of critical thinking is at least familiar to most audiences. In education, critical thinking is something of a buzzword. In business, there are consultants who run workshops on critical and creative thinking. What people actually understand by the term is another thing, but I can get in front of any academic or professional audience here, and people will have some idea of what the topic is about. But outside of North America, you can't assume as much. The term critical thinking isn't commonly used. It's very much an American invention. The language of logic and argumentation is common enough in academic circles. People study deductive and inductive logic all over the world. People write persuasive, argumentative essays all over the world. But the term critical thinking, as it's come to be used in North America, has its roots in an educational movement that came out of a particular moment in American history. In the 1960s, the US saw the rise of a new political awareness with the civil rights movement, the women's rights movement, the environmental movement, Vietnam and the anti-war movement, the anti-nuke movement. On university campuses across the country, young people were talking and arguing about these issues. And academics realized that they didn't have any good tools to help these students think critically and argue productively about these issues. Formal logic was taught at a very high level of sophistication in philosophy and math departments. And most philosophy students learned some basic Aristotelian and propositional logic. But none of this was all that useful in helping students reason informally about real-world issues like these. So there was a push to develop courses on informal logic, informal reasoning, with applications to contemporary social and political issues. That's the birth of what's known as the informal logic movement in logic and philosophy, and it's a predecessor of what came to be known as the critical thinking movement in the late 60s and early 70s. The critical thinking movement was a movement in U.S. education that argued that a fundamental goal of public education should be to teach students how to use techniques of argument analysis to critically examine our beliefs and assumptions. It had some limited success, and mostly in higher education. The key development was in 1980, when the state of California began requiring all colleges and universities in the California state system to require a course in critical thinking for all undergraduates as a general education requirement. Now, this is a huge number of students to teach, and it caused a boom in the production of critical thinking textbooks and courses. With textbooks available, many of them written by philosophy professors employed in the California state system, these courses eventually spread to other states and to Canada. These critical thinking textbooks seem to settle on a common structure. There's a section on language and meaning, a basic concept, some logic and argumentation, some deductive logic, some inductive logic, logical fallacies, some elements of scientific reasoning, some elements of moral reasoning, and so on. This is the template for a lot of textbooks in this genre. And the courses were taught mostly by philosophy professors in philosophy departments or humanities departments at the post-secondary level. Now, I say this movement had only limited success because it's still the case that, proportionally, very few college and university students are exposed to this material. And even when they are, it's just one course. But what it did do is raise awareness of the importance of critical thinking skills within education circles more broadly. People saw the connection between critical thinking and what's required of citizens in a democratic society. How the public good is served by having more people be able to critically engage with issues that matter to them, like the decision to go to war, how to manage healthcare, the limits of free speech, how to best deal with poverty and crime, and so on. And in the 90s, businesses started talking about the value of critical thinking and communication skills in their employees. So that helped to frame these as so-called soft skills that are in demand in the business world. So now, every education mission statement of practically every educational institution in the US and Canada pays lip service to critical thinking, and teachers generally think that part of their job is to teach students how to think critically. But with a few exceptions, there is still no requirement for a course in the public school system dedicated to critical thinking as such, at any level. In my honest view, it's a lot of talk with very little effort to take the mandate seriously. At any rate, my point is that if you're talking about critical thinking to a North American audience, you've got some shared background that you can leverage in your presentation. Outside of the US and Canada, you need to be careful about what you assume. But if you're talking to an audience that is at least on board with the values of liberal democracy, then you're pretty safe in talking about the importance of being able to challenge assumptions, criticize authority, and think for yourself, and so on. Now, in East Asian countries, we have a different situation. We know there's more emphasis on collective values and social harmony. The value of the individual and individual autonomy is viewed through a different cultural lens. In Confucianism, for example, there's a natural hierarchy of social authority, and it's a moral virtue to respect this hierarchy. And in modern China, we have an ostensibly communist, single-party state that controls the media, places stronger limits on freedom of expression, and that cracks down on oppositional dissent. It's an authoritarian state, but it's one that seems to have the support of the people. Surveys show that the Chinese have quite a high level of trust in their government overall. So in this context, it's not at all clear to me going in how the concept of critical thinking, as I usually present it, is going to be received by a Chinese audience. I can't just assume, for example, that the audience will agree that critical thinking skills are a public good because they're important for democratic citizenship. The word democracy doesn't resonate the same way in China as it does back home, nor do concepts like autonomy and agency. So in preparing the talk, what I decided to do was frame the discussion as an historical introduction to the concept of critical thinking in the West. So in that context, I can talk about the influence of the Greeks in medieval Europe and the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment on this evolving conception of human reason, and of the centrality of the individual in modern ethical and political and epistemological thinking, to show that these values have a cultural history right up through the 20th century and the critical thinking education movement in the United States. So that's what I did. And then in that context, I raised some objections to how critical thinking education is conceptualized and taught in the West. These objections will be familiar to anyone following the Argument Ninja podcast. Critical thinking education, as represented by curriculum in these commonly used textbooks, by and large, ignores the psychological dimension, the actual mechanisms that determine how people form beliefs and make decisions. It ignores the connections between persuasive rhetoric, good argumentation, and psychology. It ignores the social dimensions of cognition, how we rely on groups and culture to carry the burden of much of our thinking. And it fails to recognize how hostile the current media environment is to critical thinking, how people are subject to persuasive messaging around the clock that is engineered to exploit cognitive biases and bypass our conscious, deliberative reasoning processes. So after all this, I proceed to talk about solutions, how to approach critical thinking education in a way that directly addresses these concerns. It's got to be more multidisciplinary, more psychologically astute, more skill-oriented, and so on. Now, the way I frame the solution is to use the example of martial arts instruction and the distinction between training for the dojo and training for the street as a way of exploring how we can combine really effective training in argumentation and persuasion without sacrificing critical thinking values. Anyway, the talk was well received, I think. The audience was a good deal larger than my first talk and mostly made up of graduate students from various programs with some faculty sprinkled in. And the Q&A afterward was very interesting. The first comment I got was from a female student who straight up said that Chinese education doesn't teach critical thinking at any level. And you could tell that she was pissed about this, that she wasn't afraid of saying things that were critical of this aspect of her culture and her government, at least on this topic. For a minute, I was afraid she might have crossed a line that might get her in trouble. But afterward, I talked with Dr. Zhu about this issue of policing speech, and she said that in academic context, there really isn't much to worry about. The government knows that in teaching contexts, you need the freedom to talk about all sorts of views. And even in print and online, you can get away with speech that is critical of the government. What the government really cares about isn't so much critical speech as incitement to organize. They want to prevent organized political action that would undermine the government's status and effectiveness. Now, if you become famous in Chinese media, that can be a problem because now almost anything you say has the power to influence a lot of people. But academics in their classrooms, writing their papers, they really don't have that much to worry about. Anyway, another student asked a question about whether I thought that it was possible for everyone, every citizen of a country, to develop these kinds of critical thinking skills. Because in his experience, he believed that only the elite classes in society could be educated this way. At first, I thought the question was whether any political system could survive if all of a sudden, with a snap of your fingers, you could upload all of these critical thinking skills I had been talking about to every citizen of a country. And my first reaction to that question, I have to say, is I don't know. I assume that many political systems would not survive, that it would blow many political systems apart. But it's a thought experiment that I haven't spent enough time thinking about. But that actually wasn't his question. His question was whether I thought it was practically possible to educate everyone in this way, or whether I thought it would always be a skill set that only a minority of people would ever develop. And my answer to that question was that I expect it will always be a minority concern. There's always been a division of cognitive labor. That's how societies organize themselves. But what I do think is possible and desirable is that any given individual have the opportunity to learn these skills, that the resources are available so that if someone wants to learn how to improve their thinking and decision-making, wants to learn how to become a more skilled and independent critical thinker, they have a place to go that is accessible and that isn't prohibitively expensive. Give people the opportunity, and some of them will surely take it. And we will all be better off for it. And that is how I frame what I'm trying to do with the Argument Ninja Academy. That's the resource that I'm trying to build, to give people an opportunity to develop a skill set that regular schooling can't provide or won't provide. Well, this has been a longish episode. I think I'm going to wrap it up here. I've got more stories I could share, but I think you got a sense of what went on during the trip and how much I valued the experience. I had a couple of days of touring and sightseeing, which were great. I spent some quality time with several of the students who chaperoned me on some of these tours. Like I said, if you'd like to see pictures from the trip, including pictures of me with students in various lectures, I've got a whole bunch up on the blog at kevindelaplante.com and linked off the show notes for this episode at argumentninja.com. You know, in one of my Facebook posts prior to the trip, I mentioned that I would consider it a success if I was invited back, since that would indicate that my hosts thought that they got their money's worth at least. Well, the last restaurant dinner I had before leaving was with Joy, the chair of the philosophy department, a couple of other faculty, a staff person from human resources at the university, and a staff person with international programs. And at that meal, they made me an official offer to return as a visiting professor, paid on a per-day basis, to teach critical thinking to their graduate students and to participate in other academic collaborations, as they say. So if I wanted to return for 2 weeks or a month or 6 months on an annual basis, I could if I wanted to. So I consider that a sign of success. Now, to be perfectly honest, I'm not sure under what circumstances going back for any length of time would make much sense for me in my current situation. I'm an entrepreneur now, not an academic, and I'm not a classroom teacher either. Most of my income comes from monthly patrons who expect me to continue what I'm doing now, producing podcasts and videos and working on new training programs. And I have business associates now and a collaborative project that we're trying to get off the ground, the Argument Ninja Academy. So I'm not planning any long-term teaching contracts in China anytime soon. But it's always nice to be asked, right? It means you're doing something right. I want to say thank you to everyone who is contributing as a sustaining member on Patreon over at patreon.com/KevinDelaplante, or who is enrolled in the monthly Pay What You Want deal over at the Critical Thinker Academy at criticalthinkeracademy.com. You guys helped keep the lights on. I couldn't do any of this without your support. I had 2 people email me this past month asking how I'm doing finance-wise. One was out of curiosity because he's an academic who was interested in getting into online teaching. The other was an old friend who knew I'd been going through some stressful times this year. I'll save the details for another episode, but the short answer is yes, I do still need your support. I'm slowly closing in on my monthly revenue goals, but I'm still below my total monthly expenses on a regular basis. So we're living month to month with a deficit every month and a very tiny runway left. and no margin to deal with emergencies. So in spite of my good cheer and encouraging things like this trip to China, the stress is real, and it won't go away until my monthly support crosses a certain threshold. And the fact is that we're still about $1,000 a month away from that threshold. So if you've ever considered becoming a patron and think you can spare $3 a month or more, we would be very grateful for your support. I've got a big presentation coming up in Boston in a couple of weeks at the National Conference of State Legislatures Summer Conference, and I'll let you know how that goes when I get back. In the meantime, please check out the show notes for this episode. Like I said, I've got lots of pictures from the trip. Thanks again, see you next time, and hope you all have a great week.